This level of decentralisation for a relatively small country is what makes Bosnia and Herzegovina unique, and it was a requirement for the peace that was desperately needed to enable the economic recovery that followed. It took until 2003 for the GDP of the nation to eventually recover back to levels last seen in 1990, requiring an average annual growth rate of 22% following the end of the war. And yes, much of this growth derives from redeployment of huge spare capacity in the labour market, but even when these factors are accounted for, there's no denying that a 22% average annual growth rate over almost an entire decade is an impressive feat. So how did this recovery actually happen? In the first years of peace, a lot of the recovery can of course be attributed to the vast sums of post-war foreign aid that Bosnia and Herzegovina received from the international community for reconstruction of damaged and destroyed infrastructure, which includes $5.1 billion from the World Bank, the EU, and partner donors. As time went on, however, the economic growth became increasingly driven by the pro-capitalist reforms that constituted the nation's transition from market socialism to private enterprise. To be clear, this transition of economic systems was not as extreme as other countries across Central and Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR. As part of Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Herzegovina was already using free markets to allocate production and exchange, with enterprises either being state-owned or worker-owned and managed. In the later half of the 1990s and early 2000s, large state-owned enterprises started to be privatised, which signalled opportunity to European banks, who started to provide liquidity and management expertise to the country's newly reformed banking sector. Insolvent banks were closed, state-owned banks were privatised, a new regulatory framework was introduced to drive return on investment and manage systemic risk. Additional private property laws were also introduced alongside the establishment of key institutions such as 2 stock exchanges and the central bank. After the war, many different currencies were circulating with no generally accepted standard of payment, and so a key factor of the recovery was the introduction of a new currency, the convertible mark, in 1998. Not only did it standardise the monetary system, but it also generated financial stability since it was pegged to the Deutschmark and eventually the euro in 1999. A currency is pegged when it has a fixed exchange rate to another currency. The value of the currency is not affected by supply and demand in the foreign exchange market against the peg because the central bank cancels out large movements by counteracting the market when it needs to, using its reserve holdings of both currencies. When there's excess demand for the domestic currency on the market, the central bank will sell some of this domestic currency reserve to match this excess. On the other hand, if there's excess supply of the domestic currency on the market, the central bank will buy the excess using its reserves of the peg currency. This ensures balance in the markets, preventing the currency from deviating from the currency it's pegged to, and as a result, the Bosnia and Herzegovina economy benefits from the stability that the euro-backed currency brings. Now, it's worth noting that peg currencies don't always work in practice, and there is some risk involved. Take, for example, the Russian ruble in 1998, which was pegged to the US dollar. Investors were selling the ruble hard and fast, which forced the Central Bank of Russia to buy the ruble using US dollars to defend its currency value. After selling 27 billion of its US dollar reserves in under a year, the central bank ran out of US dollars and the peg finally broke. The ruble devalued by 2/3 in just over a month, which meant the price of imported goods soared, causing inflation and huge drops in real living standards. So far, however, the Bosnian and Herzegovinian central bank has successfully maintained the pegged exchange rate, which has fostered confidence in the currency and attracted significant amounts of foreign investment. This rewrote the nation's narrative from one of post-war recovery to one of rapid modernisation and development. The large inflows of foreign direct investment generated employment, improved infrastructure, and helped to establish key export sectors in the national economy, such as electricity and metal manufacturing. This was a pretty standard and promising development path for a country with close access to both markets in the East and the West. But it didn't last forever. Fast forward to the present day, and foreign direct investment still makes up a huge portion of the economy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly in banking and manufacturing. The latest statistics value the total stock of FDI to be worth about $9.3 billion US dollars. However, net inflows decreased significantly after the 2008 financial crisis, which, like so many other nations, appears to be a turning point for the trajectory of the economy. Private investment from within the country has not picked up this slack either, and the reason for this is that Bosnia and Herzegovina has some of the highest administrative burdens for business not just across Europe, but across the entire world. In 2020, the World Bank found that there are only 6 countries in the world where registering a new business is more difficult. The country is also ranked 173rd for ease of doing business with construction permits and 141st for paying taxes. Although most recent data is a few years old now, and the country ranks slightly better for other ease of doing business metrics, this is clearly discouraging for both foreign and domestic investors who may not have the time and legal know-how to properly administer their business operations in such a complicated regulatory framework. This explains why Bosnia and Herzegovina has a large informal economy, which is a whole other problem itself. These issues are largely caused by the political system within Bosnia and Herzegovina, which, to put it frankly, is overly complex, fragmented, and ineffective at taking action to drive economic development. While the Dayton Agreement was heralded as a success story of international peace brokering in the modern era during the 1990s, few were thinking ahead to the implications that power sharing would have on the overall functioning of the government in the long term once this peace was achieved. The political complexity begins right at the top with a tripartite political leadership structure. Every 4 years, 3 presidents are elected who represent each of the ethnic constituents of the nation: Bosniaks, Bosniak Croats, and Bosniak Serbs. These 3 presidents rotate every 8 months until the 4-year term is over, and each one has veto power to block decisions which they believe are against the interests of their ethnic group. This